Today, due to popular demand, I'm going to be going over some tips I always try to keep in the back of my head to help me survive the early game. As a heads up, these tips I give are part of a process and are really good habits more than anything else that will help you come out on top in the early game. The goal of this video isn't to make you suddenly have perfect aim or turn you into an insane builder. Rather, this video will give you an idea of how you should be making decisions in the early game, and that's going to help you regardless of your mechanical skill. As always, I have timestamps below in the description of the video that sort of outline what I'm going to be talking about, and with those you can jump between different sections of the video as you like. Okay, with all that said, let's talk about some key tips you can use to help you dominate the early game. Alright, so the first thing you have to be thinking about in order to succeed in the early game is picking a good drop spot. This topic alone could take up a whole video, but for the sake of time, I'll list a few things I plan out when picking a drop spot. Firstly, if my goal is to win, I always try to pick a drop spot I'm comfortable with. I talked about this a little in my How to Loot Faster video, but there are a number of advantages that come from dropping somewhere you're familiar with. To list just a couple, you're going to be able to move around the area faster if you know it well, you're going to be able to loot faster, and you'll be able to predict where other players are going to be located in that area. If every game you're dropping into a new location, it's going to be really hard for you to succeed in the early game because you'll be looting slower and you won't know where players are, and on top of all that, you'll have to spend a lot of time figuring out the location instead of actually spending that time doing things that are going to give you a better chance at winning. Of course, if you want to go tour the map, have at it, but if your goal really is to win, try to familiarize yourself with a few locations around the map and then plan on dropping there so that you'll always have somewhere you're comfortable going to. Secondly, with picking a good drop spot, you have to pick somewhere that both has a lot of loot and that also has relatively low players. The reality is, dropping at Tilted Towers is rarely ever going to work out. But at the same time, dropping Junk Junction every game isn't very fun either. So you want to look for locations that offer a good player count and loot balance. If you're going for the win and you want a relatively active game where you aren't just camping in the corner of the map to get to top 10, I would recommend going to a large town that has around 3 to 4 players at max. You want other players there for a couple of reasons. Of course you want to fight people, but you also want them to help you loot by getting loot and then giving it to you when you kill them later. The goal should be to loot for a few minutes and then engage with 1 or 2 people in your starting town and then leave with enough meds and mats to be set for the rest of the game. For me, my thought process that I find works well when I'm looking at the map at the start of the game and deciding where I want to drop is I try to look at the second half of the bus's route and then drop at a town that's 1 or 2 towns located away from that. I do this because usually people want to jump out of the bus right away, so if you're a little more patient, you can still drop into a big town like Retail Row or Paradise Palms and benefit from all the loot there, but you won't have to deal with the players that might usually come with these towns if they were at the start of the battle bus route. Every game is going to be different, and sometimes you might just get unlucky to have 10 people drop to your town when you thought there would only be 3. But if you follow these dropping guidelines, you'll be able to reduce that random factor and put yourself in a better position for the early game. Okay, now that you've picked a smart drop spot, let's talk about what you should be doing as you drop. I know this has been repeated time and time again, but when you are dropping, you want to get as low to the ground as possible so you can be the first one down. This is a pretty simple step, so I won't dwell on it too much, but try to use your map to get as low as possible before you pull your glider. That way you can drop first and have a little bit of a head start on the rest of the people in your town. Also, while you're dropping, you want to be scanning the air to see where other people are going to land. This step is really important and shouldn't go overlooked because a lot of the reason you are going to die in the early game is due to a lack of information. More than anything else, I'd say, I die in the early game because I get randomly shot when I don't expect it, so it's really important that in the early game, you know where people are around you, and you kind of have an idea of where to look for people in the town, so that way you aren't snuck up on or caught off guard. If you don't know the town well and you don't know where people are, you're going to be a sitting duck, and it's going to be really hard to have success in early game fights. For that reason, I would honestly recommend that after you loot your first house or building, you should probably use third person to peek around the town and try to scan before you go out and start moving around. That way you can get around safely and limit those random deaths that come from getting jumped out of nowhere. Now that you've dropped to a good spot and know where people are around you, you need to come up with a game plan for how you want to take fights. One of the most common pitfalls I run into in the early game is taking fights when I don't have adequate loot. If it's possible, try to avoid fighting in the early game if you don't have a shotgun. The reality is most of these early game fights are going to be close range, and pushing someone when you aren't prepared to take that fight is just bad decision making. Instead, you should use your knowledge of where other players are to loot safely until you are prepared to fight. Another common mistake I run into and I see other people face is they run out of mats in the early game. Running out of mats is a really big problem you can face, and it might even be worse than not having a shotgun, depending on the situation. So going along with this idea of preparing for fights, a rule I try to abide by is always farm around 200 mats before you take your first fight in the early game. Ideally, from this point, once you have a shotgun and you've gathered enough materials to fight, if your town has around 3 or 4 people, generally speaking what you want to do is wait for 2 players to fight and then come in afterwards to clean up. Now you aren't always going to be able to decide when you fight. Sometimes players are going to come at you and you'll have to respond. But coming back to that idea earlier, if you know where other people are in the town, you can put yourself in a spot where you are coming in after 2 people fight rather than somebody else coming in after you finish a fight. And that's going to give you a much better chance at leaving the first town and surviving the early game. Okay, that about covers it for how to approach the early game.
Hey, what's up everybody? It's your boy Keith Allen, and our first pro player analysis of Season 8 is on the boy wonder himself, Mongrel. We're also really excited to announce that we partnered with Mongrel to create the most advanced Fortnite guide ever. Now, all you have to do is register on ProGuides.com, and you can do it for free. To hype you up for the course, let's jump right into a creative 1v1. Mongrel has been playing against other pro players in creative. In this fight, he's against Fnatic Motor. We're going to watch this fight all the way through before we go back and analyze certain key points. Let's get started.
You got lucky.
I play like Manon, like he's just so defensive.
So this guy that's breaking all my shit.
In a row, let's go. 7 kill win and 9 kill win.
Nice one, play, bro. How many rifts did you have left?
50.
Wait, what? I said how many rifts do you have left? You should use them all.
Kidding, I had one. I got an extra one from a kill though. At one point fucking 4 people jumped into my box and I just trapped like 2 of them. Killed 2 of them. I don't even know what happened there.
I'm dead. Oh my god, I fucked up double. And I fucked up 3 times.
That was such an easy win.
Mongrel starts off spamming 90s, but right at this moment, you can see him tilt his camera for a second. He sees that Motor is below him. From this point, Mongrel knows that all he has to do is triple 90 one more time to secure height. The ability to build that fast and still keep track of his surroundings is why Mongrel is a beast. Let's move on to the next important detail. Mongrel decides to shoot Motor down during his retake. However, since the fight has so many builds, Motor was able to connect to old builds. A lot of players will give up in Turtle, but look at what Mongrel does here. High ground players can't see when you're directly beneath them. Mongrel bought himself enough time to find a weak spot and broke Motor down. Although Mongrel doesn't retake high ground here, he at least gave himself a chance. And speaking of retakes, let's watch the key moment that sealed Mongrel the win. Mongrel fights for high ground with a bunch of cone wall ramp tunnels. After a bunch of tunnels, Motor makes two huge mistakes back to back. His random side jump and then turning his back to Mongrel. These two mistakes pretty much sealed the deal. That's why dealing damage is arguably more important than high ground. Let's jump ahead and break down how Mongrel was able to close out the fight. Mongrel edits down from high ground to play aggressively. Motor takes his chance to retake high ground and Mongrel responds with a new defensive technique.
I'm dead. Oh my god, I fucked up double.
To close out the fight, Mongrel spams retakes until Motor messes up. From here, Mongrel sprays him out and wins the fight. Creative fights might not be realistic, but they're a great place to learn new building techniques. Practice the special ramp tunnel, the vertical tunnel, and general build fight awareness in your own creative 1v1s. If something didn't make sense in this clip, then seriously go back and watch it again. Everything he did was useful. If you don't need to rewatch the clip, then let's move ahead and watch a 5-kill pop-off. I want to focus on two things in this clip: his great chip shots and his tracking. Both of these things are extremely important. They are both really huge parts of build fighting. Mongrel wins high ground with the basic ramp floor wall and forces his opponent to cover up. The shot that Mongrel took here was a pre-aimed shot. It wasn't a mistake. He was expecting an edit. He follows up by coning the floor, which is something you should always do. To end the fight, take a look at how Mongrel sways from side to side as he edits. If you go for an edit play, then never stand still. Let's jump forward and see how Mongrel handles being pushed by an entire squad. Mongrel starts with the long-range cone, but lands a full damage pump instead. Most players would hide here and end up dying. You need to go for a retake instead. He hits a side jump and follows up with some Tfue classics. Although he fumbles the edit, he definitely had the right idea. Now, before we move on, let's talk about thirsting. I know it's the end thing to do, but there are some downsides. If Mongrel had thirsted, then he'd lose high ground. Instead, he stays up top and lands a huge shot on another player. He follows up by counter-building with floors and begins pressuring walls. Right as he pushes in, he gets shot down, but lucks out on a fall damage bug. Anyways, he's in the middle of the entire squad, and again, most players would turtle and probably lose. He does the same thing and goes for the retake instead of turtling. Another thing I want to point out is that he's using the special ramp tunnel again. Mongrel sees a player under him and tracks him for an easy shot. His opponent is building way too slow and gets caught up by a jump peak. Again, Mongrel continues fighting instead of thirsting. Once he finds his next enemy, he actually makes a mistake by building a wall. His opponent could have phased through and fought back, so I would have liked to see an aggressive all-in instead. Regardless, he goes for the chase and lands another chip shot and follows up with a nice cone. Now he's clear for the retake. He also lands another chip shot and breaks shield. Let's listen to the game sound and see if you can track exactly where this player is. From this spot, where is his opponent? Let's find out. If you knew the whole way through, then comment below. Alright, well, let's get back to the clip. There are two things that I really want you to learn from this clip. The first is chip damage. Always go for it because it adds up and makes your opponent play scared. You can always go for chip damage in build fights, so keep trying. The second is tracking with sound. You can practice your tracking without pressure by watching streams and trying to predict where players will be, just like I had you do in this clip.
I gotta one pump this guy. He's at attack. hell that's going on? Yeah, oh. Whoa, fam!